Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. I am fresh from the Aspen Institute's Ideas Festival, but I am not refreshed, for I was one of the many millions of victims this week of travel delays, bad weather, gremlins, dyspepsia, and whatnot, and so I am didn't get in until after midnight, and am as listeners know, I am wont to strange visions when I am sleep deprived. But nonetheless, as a pick me up, I'm very excited to have a new guest on the Remnant, and also a relatively new contributor to the Dispatch, Jeremiah Johnson. He's a co-founder of something called the Center for New Liberalism, and he's also the author of the excellent Substack, which is one of the things that caught our attention, Infinite Scroll. Jeremiah, I loved you in the 1972 film where you were played by Robert Redford. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me. And it's funny, this is a very age-related thing where only people above a certain age get that reference. I was actually named after that movie. My father, I believe, saw that movie way back in the 70s and thought, he was 10 years old and thought, wow, that guy's cool. And my last name's Johnson, so I'm going to have a kid named Jeremiah Johnson. And later he did. Yeah.
So I have a similar baptismal origin story in that my parents got the idea for the name Jonah when they saw a black jazz trumpeter Jonah Jones play, and they, oh, Jonah, that's a really cool name. The problem is when you attach it to Goldberg, it I shouldn't say the problem, but the thing is when you attach it to Goldberg, it resonates Jewishness in a way that is very hard to sort of overlook.
I've also been mistaken for a member of the tribe because Jeremiah is normally you're either Jewish or black in America.
For sure, Jeremiah. Yeah, it's definitely Old Testament. So, but the thing is like I have no problem having that jazz musician as the inspiration for my name, but the movie Jeremiah Johnson was a movie based on someone's true life story, and the actual John Jeremiah Johnson was a mountain man in Utah who ate the livers of the Native Americans because the crow killed his family apparently, and so his thing was he would kill crow warriors and eat their livers. Does it ever
called him Liver Eaton Johnson, I believe? Yeah,
that's right. I mean, I'm a practitioner of what you might call neoliberalism. So leaning into your comparative advantage, if that's your brand, is liver eating, you might as well put the shingle out front. But have you ever run into anybody who has sort of issues with the not with the Robert Redford character, but with the actual character?
I don't think anybody dives that deep. There's a nice brewery out in Montana. The most it's ever impacted real life is that there's a brewery in Montana called the Jeremiah Johnson Brewery, named after the mountain man. And at various points, I've asked people who are visiting Yellowstone or whatever to fly me back a case of beer so that I can have beer with my name on it. But that's about as far as it goes.
Well, we much like Jeremiah Johnson, we cleave new paths in the wilderness here on the Remnant. All right, so tell me, just for level setting purposes, both for me and for the audience, one of the things about our contributor program is we want to have cast a wider net, and we get a lot of people who we don't want to be ideologically monochromatic or anything like that. We want the best voices from different places and all of that kind of thing. You have to be philosophically acceptable, but you can be we don't necessarily have to agree with you, right? And that kind of thing. And so what is the Center for New Liberalism?
Well, it's funny that you called yourself a neoliberal because we started our lives also calling ourselves neoliberals. This is something that grew out of various social media spaces in the wake of Trump's first election. All the energy, right, seemed to be with the populist right, with the MAGA movement, or with the populist left, with Bernie Sanders' whole campaign, which, didn't win the Democratic primary, but people saw that that's where the energy was. And there were a bunch of us who thought, look, what we want is kind of sane, responsible capitalism. that doesn't want to destroy the welfare state, but that still wants, to remain a capitalist society. And we want, contra to Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, we think that globalism has largely been a force for good. International trade is good. Immigration can be very good for the countries that, it's certainly been very good for America. And we don't want to burn down international institutions. And so we started something called the Neoliberal Project that then became the Center for New Liberalism. And essentially, it started, like I said, as a social media space that quickly got so popular we had to turn it into a real organization. it,
Mm-hmm.
it had hundreds of thousands of people in various subreddits, in Twitter accounts, podcasts. And then people started saying, hey, let's all meet up. We're all online, we're all talking to each other. And that became our first chapters. And now, a few years later, we are kind of a formal 501c4 organizing group with chapters in 70 to 80 cities around the country that do local organizing, that try to get involved in local politics, show up to their city council meetings and make noise about how we need to build more damn housing. um, it's a bunch of things like that. We've got a big online presence, but what we're focused on right now is growing the real world presence and kind of getting our people on the ground in the cities that they live in into their local politics.
That's great. I'm glad you exist, and I'm glad what you're doing. I'll just, for clarity's sake, I was trying to I was trying to speak your love language when I associated myself with neoliberalism. I prefer the older. I'm a classical liberal more than I am a neoliberal, but then again, I've spent a good deal of time on this, and one of my favorite uh, writers on intellectual history, Phil Magnus, has written some great stuff on how neoliberalism is one of these kind. I mean, this happened with
Okay, can I
neoconservatism. It
say
happened,
something about the word itself? Because I think
yeah.
there's an interesting history of the word where, and Phil would probably be able to tell you the same thing, but neoliberalism is interesting because it very much came out as a reaction to the perceived failure of classical liberalism, right? The,
Mm-hmm.
the word started to gain traction in like the 1930s, the late 1930s and early 1940s. As you look around the world and you see like Stalinist communism taking hold in one part of the world, and you see actual Nazi fascism taking part in it, the other part of Europe. And people look around and they're thinking, well, is classical liberalism failing? Is the liberal project writ large kind of going to collapse in on itself, as these various forms of authoritarianism kind of build themselves up? Thinkers of the age said we need to build a new liberalism that is more robust, that can deal with these kind of authoritarian ideological challenges, and they called it neoliberalism, right? And we kind of very self-consciously, number one, knowing that it would get us a lot of attention on the internet to be like, we're neoliberals and we're proud of it. But number two, we chose that word specifically because we think this is an age where authoritarianism is once again kind of rearing its head both on the left and the right, and that there needs to be somebody to reinvent liberalism, to build a new, better liberalism that is able to withstand the challenges that we're seeing. So I'm very much with you in the form of like, I consider myself a liberal first and foremost, whether you want to
Right.
say political liberal, American liberal, philosophically liberal, neoliberal, like yes, and all of that
Mm-hmm.
is fine with me. But I am primarily concerned with ensuring that liberalism sticks around and builds upon itself.
Yeah. I mean, it is. I have, as a conservative in the sort of Burkean sense, I have profound contempt for Esperanto, right, which was the attempt to create a rational language for the whole world, right? But it is very, very, very frustrating how badly misaligned our political terminology is with our political concepts. I mean, Confucius calls for the rectification of the names, where you start calling things by what they are again. And I'm very sympathetic to that, because if you're talking about the liberal and liberal arts, I'm a liberal. If you're talking about the liberal and liberal democratic capitalism, I'm a liberal, right? If you're talking about the liberal in um, liberal political theory, I am for the most part a liberal. If you're talking about the liberal in uh, the New Deal, not so much, right? And then we'll have arguments about whether the New Deal was fundamentally to save capitalism and liberalism, or whether it was, a down payment on something else. But I don't like statism, right? I come from that sort of perspective, and it's very difficult how much time it takes clearing the decks when you're talking to people about, well, what do you mean by that word when you're using it? Because so many of them trigger us into these sort of cascading opinion trees that aren't necessarily what someone wants to be talking about.
Yeah, I mean, the worst debates in the world are the debates over what a word means, because you're
Yeah,
ignoring the idea behind it, right? But unfortunately, this is a lot of what our political discourse is these days. But the ideas that we try to stand behind, like, we work within the confines of the Democratic Party. That's kind of the lane
sure.
we've chosen. That's how we want to influence American politics and society, is by influencing the Democratic Party. And we try to make sure that the Democratic Party, in our vision of it, does not become a party of socialists. Sometimes I call us the capitalist wing of the Democratic Party. We want a Democratic Party that respects both the need for free markets and the welfare state. I'm a fan of both of those things, and I don't think they have to necessarily contradict each other. We want a Democratic Party that sticks up for, immigration and free trade and the benefits of being part of the international community, that says yes to things. We've been abundance pilled long before the book Abundance came out, in terms of
Right.
the need for environmental reform and regulatory reform and building more housing. So, we are trying to build a better Democratic Party. I think the worst thing for America that could possibly happen right now is if the Democratic Party went off the deep end in the same way that the Republican Party has, frankly. And so, somebody needs to fight to stop that for happening, and maybe that's us.
Yeah, no. So like, again, this is more get to know you conversation than we normally start on a remnant. But I haven't met you before, and we're glad to have you in the tent. And um, so just, like, I I came to Washington. My first boss was this guy Ben Wattenberg, who was the one of the founders of the Coalition for Democratic Majority, which then became the seed stock for the Democratic Leadership Council. And he was very much, he's a former LBJ guy, and he was very much a save the Democratic Party from its worst impulses on the far left guy, right? And never gave up the Democratic, Party affiliation. Was very proud to call himself Reagan's favorite Democrat, even though that was a bit of an exaggeration. But I love this tradition in the Democratic Party. The Americans for Democratic Action was heroic in the 1940s. Probably saved the country from some really terrible ugliness by basically saying you can be a New Deal liberal, social democrat as you want. You can't be a communist and part of the Democratic Party. And back then, being a communist actually meant not just being a communist, but loyal to a foreign power. And so you ended up getting, kicking Wallace, not the George Wallace, but Henry Wallace, out of the Democratic Party, and he becomes sort of the I don't think he was a knowing communist agent, but he was surrounded by a bunch of them. And but for those kinds of efforts, I think we would have been in a much worse place in this country. And I hope you guys succeed, because even though I am sort of done with both parties, I've come to the conclusion that you can't have just one sane political party. You have to have two, because otherwise you don't get the the healthy competition between parties. If one goes crazy populist on the right and the other one goes crazy populist on the left, um, they don't compete over positive public policy changes. They compete over sort of what Julian Bender would call the organization of political hatreds, and they compete over who can pander more to various constituencies. And that is a vicious cycle, not a virtuous cycle.
Yeah, well, and even the more basic point that, look, our politics is set up such that each party wins about half of the elections, and
Right.
maybe we're going to enter a different era. Maybe one party will control the next 80 years of elections, but I don't think that's likely. So it matters if one party is totally insane, because they're gonna control the government a decent amount of the time. So,
That's fair. That's fair.
and I don't know, maybe this is a segue to talk about what's going on nationally or here in New York where I'm based.
Yeah,
There's a
so
lot of insane things happening.
so I was going to use the conversation about labels a minute ago in proper terms. Is that one of the things I'm very grateful to Zohran Mamdani, now the Democratic nominee for mayor in New York City, um, is that he does everybody a huge favor by actually using terms like seize the means of production unapologetically, which I tell you, growing up in right wing circles, I have dozens of jokes about Bernie Sanders trying to seize the means of production, um, and then he just comes out and I mean I know he said it in 2021, but Mandami clearly comes from a wing of I don't even want to say the Democratic Party except in New York, but like a wing of left wing politics that is really proud and wholly unapologetic of its radicalism. And just big picture, I'm just wondering, you can touch on some of the stuff that you wrote for us, but now that he is the nominee, where do you see this going and how do you think he got there?
He's a really interesting figure to me. He's fascinating to think about because he is essentially like a theater kid who has unexpectedly been thrust into power. And I don't even think he expected this to happen. Like, his family is like very much an artsy family. The father, I believe, is a professor at Columbia, and his mother's a well-known director. Some of her movies are quite good, by the way.
Yeah,
I would
Mississippi
recommend them.
Masala was a great movie, right? I mean, there are
Yeah,
some,
absolutely.
yeah,
Um, but so the best way to understand Zoran, I think, is especially in his early days when he's doing all this stuff, 2019, 2020, 2021. This is before he has any power, before he's been elected to anything. He is saying all this stuff like, we need to overthrow capitalism, we need to seize the means of production, defund the police. It's something he said a lot in that era. And even like he said it with his whole chest in the sense that other people would say, defund the police just means we are, reorienting the paradigm of policing to be about blah,
right,
blah, 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 blah. And he would like quote tweet them and say, no, I want to defund the police. Straight like I'm not being ambiguous about it. And so that era of Zohran Mamdani can best be understood literally as like a Brooklyn theater kid
mm-hmm.
who dabbles in socialist politics because it is cool and it is like what the cool kids do, and it is purely a form of cultural signaling to him. And then somehow, through a series of hijinks and extremely strange coincidences, he actually ends up where he's now going to be the mayor of New York City. And I think that's the best lens through which to see him. And you can actually see him now that he is very close to the reins of, holding the reins of power. He is rapidly marching backwards from a lot of those things. He now says that he does not want to defund the police. And you can have this debate about is he just like redefining his words? Is he just doing the politician weasel word of, what the definition of is, right? But he's running away from a lot of those things. And now he's trying to focus himself on being more, laser focused on the cost of living and a lot of this stuff. But that's the background of Zohran is you've got to understand this kind of Brooklyn arts socialist more than you have to understand the actual politics of it. You have to understand the culture of that scene in order to kind of get where he's coming from.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's well put. I mean, I actually don't want to show any disrespect to Africana Studies, which was his major at Bowdoin. I think that's a perfectly legitimate thing. I mean, Africana is a bit of a tell, but okay.
At
I
least it
mean,
wasn't Afrikanex. So,
right, right. I mean, but African studies, I got no problem. The guy's born in Uganda. I got. But Bowdoin, now Bowdoin, on the other hand, I'm perfectly fine heaping great scorn on, and but he, I know, I agree with you entirely. It's his type that of it's very performative, and doesn't mean it's not sincere, right? But I was recently writing about how if you take the millions of words that Karl Marx wrote, um, the number of words dedicated to actually how communism would actually work, like what would taxation look like? How do you provide for social services? It's less than a takeout menu from Taco Bell. I mean, it's just this tiny proportion of words, and but there are millions and millions of words about why the system is bad, all of this sort of romantic stuff about our feelings and rebellion and all that kind of stuff. And I've always thought that Marxism, that sort of performative Marxism, was always the performative part that matters. It was a way to sort of um, wear your passions on your sleeve more than it is an actually serious program. And so I kind of like the unseriousness of a lot of Zohran's program, because I think it's a footnote, but it's an interesting footnote to this larger trend that Marxism, really doctrinaire Marxism, was always sort of a Potemkin village intellectually. It was always more of a light show than an actual serious public policy program.
Well, and one of the interesting things that this echoes Donald Trump's rise in 2016, and it talks to the seriousness of the program here, is that what the best case that I've heard for voting for Zohran, when there's this big debate in Democratic circles about Zohran versus Cuomo, because Cuomo is personally very odious and genuinely like a bad person in a wide variety of ways. He's
Sure.
sexually harassed a bunch of women. He's a power hungry maniac who has no loyalty to anybody or anything.
Killed a bunch of old
And
people. I
yeah,
mean,
and
some of
he
that was
killed
an
a bunch of
understandable
old people.
mistake.
Yeah.
Some of that was an understandable mistake, I think. But the cover up of it and his handling of once he realized what he had done was showed really poor character. But anyway, I'm
Yeah,
sorry to
like
interrupt.
just being in New York and like I don't know Andrew Cuomo personally, but I probably shouldn't say their names, but I'll just say because they haven't said it's okay, but I know several people who have directly worked with him,
Mm-hmm.
significantly close to Cuomo, and pretty much everybody agrees he's a piece of shit. Like
Yeah.
everything that I have heard is that he's just genuinely not a good person. And so there's this big debate in Democratic circles during the primary. Should we vote for Cuomo, who's also not even good on housing or others? Like he's not good on transit. He's not good on housing. He's a NIMBY. And so it's like we're going to get potentially a NIMBY either way. Should we vote for the socialist NIMBY or the corrupt jerk, gerontocratic, nonsense? And the best argument that I heard for Zohran during that entire time was that, well, he's not going to be able to do the things he says he wants to do. So, like, what does it matter? And this was also something that I feel like many Republicans were saying during the rise of Trump 1.
Yeah.
Well, Trump is kind of a dangerous idiot, but he'll be restricted. He's not actually going to be able to do anything that he wants to do. And which is, if that's the best thing you can say about somebody, is that they're not going to be able to do the things they want, that's a warning sign. But it does speak to the practicality and the pragmatism that are missing in a lot of this. And I don't know. I
Yeah. No,
still feel very
I think.
conflicted about Zoran because I think that he could go in a lot of directions. Part of the things that's interesting about him is he's so young. He's 33 years old. He's been a one-term state senator. He could end up being anything. He could
Mhm.
moderate. He could go way even further to the left. Like it's really unknown exactly what he's going to do.
Um, you said in your piece about the mayor's race that Andrew Cuomo doesn't even. It's not clear he even considers himself a New Yorker. Um, I grew up in New York City. That kind of like I was like, huh. But I haven't lived there in a long time. What was, just out of curiosity? What was that about?
Andrew Cuomo has, for the last 30 to 40 years, lived in either Albany while he was being the governor, or he lived in Westchester County, which is the suburbs
Sure.
north of New York. He is, in terms of being a city person, a New Yorker, not from the state, but from the city, Andrew Cuomo basically is not a New Yorker. Like he
Hmm.
drives everywhere. That part of the reason that I think he lost is that Zohran very obviously loves New York City. Like he is
Hmm.
of and from New York City. He was raised here. He bleeds out. Like you can tell how much he loves it. He did that stunt where he walked from the top of Manhattan to the bottom. And meanwhile, and Zoran like doesn't own a car. He takes the bus and he takes the subway everywhere. And Cuomo drives around. He drives around in a big like armored car looking thing, and you know there was something where like he lives like 3 blocks from where his polling site was, and on the
Mm-hmm.
day that he was supposed to go vote, he had aides like holding a parking spot out front for him because they were like, "Oh, it's 3 blocks. He's going to drive." Which, like in New York City,
Is nuts.
why
Yeah.
would you do that? Like, it's not even clear. He moved here in 2024. Cuomo did, and he lives supposedly on like somewhere on the Upper East Side, I think. But like, he doesn't feel like a New Yorker. He doesn't feel like somebody who cares about the city whatsoever. He's basically not lived here in decades. Why are you running from it? Like, part of the tragedy of this is that the centrist lane in the mayor's primary was taken, like he sucked up all the attention, and it made it impossible for any other centrist to exist in that lane, and he was such a terrible candidate,
Yeah.
such a terrible weak candidate, and that's part of why we're in the mess with Zohran that we're in right now.
So I want to circle back to this point about Zoran wouldn't be able to do the things he says he can do. Um, and I assume I don't think you finished the thought, but like the reason that's a pro argument for Zoran is like the downside risks aren't that great, but he'll blow up the system, he'll send a message, all that kind of stuff, and what's the worst he could do because he can't get these things done, right? And um, I had to say I hate this line of argument. I agree with you. It's probably the best case for him, but I hate it because I've lived through it in the Trump era. And so here's the problem with that, in my opinion. Bernie Sanders is a populist. Donald Trump is a populist. William Jennings Bryan was a populist. There's a long history to populism. Populism is, um, um, it probably, you could argue it goes back to ancient times, but it's just it. But it becomes a real force with the rise of modern communication technology. First, the printing. The people forget every time you give a new mass communication thing, you get a populist upheaval, starting with the printing press, right? And we had it with radio, we had it with TV, now we have it with social media and all that kind of stuff. The problem, among the many problems with social media, with populism, is that the anatomy of a populist argument, whether it comes from the right or the left, is that first of all, you are appealing to people as victims, right? Who have, and you are cultivating a sense of entitlement and grievance rather than anything particularly hopeful to a certain extent. And well, I shouldn't say that. The hopeful part comes that we are going to have our comeuppance and that we are going to triumph over the forces that are stopping us. And moreover, the more important part of the argument is that we know exactly what to do, and it's very, very easy. And, as Bart Simpson says when he's running for class president, my opponent says there are no easy answers. I say he's not looking hard enough. And so you have, uh, you know, Bernie Sanders says it'd be very easy to have the Green New Deal, very easy to have Medicare for all. It's no problem, just tax millionaires and billionaires, and we get there, right? Trump says everything is easy. And the worst thing possible is that it's going to take 2 weeks to get to it, right? And the problem with populist arguments, historically, going back through Europe, going back to the United States, is that because these things are not easy, right? They actually require serious thought and serious effort and serious buy-in from the other party and other stakeholders, and they require politics and political skill and hard work, and so they fail. And so then what happens is you're never going to get Bernie Sanders to say, oh, it turns out our ideas were really crappy. What you're going to get him to say is that these sinister forces, the billionaire class stopped us. The special interests stopped us. He won't say the Jews, but that's a very common form of populist argument going back 500 years, which is that everything would be great except for these outsider, parasitic people. And you can call them Jews, you can call them billionaires, you can call them special interests, you can call them a whole bunch of different things. You can call them welfare queens if you want, right? But whatever it is, or you can call them woke, elites, it doesn't really matter. The whole point
Mm-hmm.
is that you never get the populists to admit they were wrong. And instead they say, they find someone to scapegoat, and then they say, next time we won't make the mistake of not having the will, right? Not the arguments, but the will to impose our new vision. And
Yeah.
that's how democracies die. That's how republics die, is with when you have those sorts of forces arguing about who has the greater will to impose their vision on their enemies.
Yeah, and the idea can never fail. It can only be failed, right?
Right.
This I like that you kind of called out the technological change that leads to this. The Because this is something I think about a lot. Like when I write at Infinite Scroll to do the most important thing, give a plug to my other work. Um,
Fair.
when I write
You would
there,
have to mention it about 17 more times to approach Tevi Troy levels of mentioning his books when he's on here. So you're in safe territory so far.
all right, well, at www.infinitescroll.us, one of the things I'm most fascinated about, and one of the things I write about a lot, is technology and kind of the social internet and how the social internet is affecting our culture and our politics and the ways in which we relate to each other as human beings. And I think you're totally correct that a lot of this is downstream of what social media and smartphones have done to us. There's a great book I love that by Martin Gurry called Revolt of the Public,
Hmm.
which basically has this theory of why politics are insane right now. And it says, the thing that social media has done is it has made the failures of the elite class more legible to everyone else. That, it back in the day, the media mostly actually just covered for the political class. And the famous example here is something like JFK and the Bay of Pigs,
Yeah.
his failed invasion of Cuba, which was a massive disaster and ended with a bunch of people dying and a huge embarrassment. And the way that the media covered it back then, national newspapers all just kind of agreed to say, well, the president's young and he's learning and he's going to do his best and this is good. He's going to do better going forward. And part of me thinks, like, could you imagine that happening today? And the reality is that, like, elites, who the people in charge of society, have always failed to live up to their promises. That's a feature of human history. But it's normally been more obscured and it's not been as obvious. Whereas now you can kind of tell in real time how much they are failing and how much they've lied to you. And it just means that everybody is mad at the people in charge all the time, forever, and it will never end. And that is the number one feature of politics that you have to kind of understand if you want to understand anything right now, is that you have to be mad at whoever's in charge, and whoever is most positioned as an outsider is the one who has the most legitimacy. And it's very much this conflict between the elites and the outside. I think Gurry calls it the border and the center.
Hmm.
And very much the center cannot hold in his model, that we are permanently going to be, rage against the machine is going to be the defining factor in politics moving forward until something changes our media systems.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to that. I do think. I mean, the problem with the current media stuff isn't the disruption per se. It's that the pace of disruption is greater than our ability to catch up with it. We eventually figured out how to process radio and TV, but the rate of inception into people's heads that you get with social media. I mean, by the time we finally figure out how to like teach our kids about TikTok and whatnot, we're gonna have implantables in our frontal lobes and like have to argue about
Mm-hmm.
those.
Well, and I
Um,
think it's just a much more potent form. Like,
yeah,
I make the comparison that, like look, media and kind of competition through media and social signaling and these status games that we play, those have always existed, right? Status has been part of human society forever. But if previous status games and media positioning were like addictive in the way that opium is addictive,
right,
then what we have now is like fentanyl. It's
right.
like a 100x times more. It's faster. It's purer. It actually would be something more like, there's like hyperfentanyl. I think it's called carfentanyl, which is like 100 times more potent than fentanyl itself. I think that we really underrate how fast social media rots people's brains. And I say this as somebody who is kind of professionally on social media, who writes about social media for a living. It is like, things are bleak out there. Like
No, I
the
agree. I
the
mean,
degree to which this is like a radicalization machine is really underrated.
they should put a picture of Mike Lee on a milk carton, given what's happened to that dude. And I agree with you entirely about that. And the thing that I find so, and also it's interesting you brought up status because I have this whole. There was an economist named Fred Hirsch who came up with the concept of positional goods, And the problem is that, and he had this devastating, depressing line where he said, um, that we cannot give people the American dream anymore because, um, the American dream is no longer about material goods; it's about status, and um, and status is a positional good insofar as there can only be one kid who's best at basketball in high school, right? And there can only be one head cheerleader. Like if you're the head cheerleader, that means somebody else isn't the head cheerleader, and human brains are wired for these gradations of judging people by their status, and social media is this relentless churn of status class. Forget the class; it's the status anxiety. That there's a great line. I think it's by Montesquieu where he says, "It'd be pretty easy for everybody to be happy. The problem is everybody wants to be happier than everybody else, and it's very difficult to know who's actually happy, right? And like social media is all about telegraphing a curated version of your lifestyle rather than your actual lifestyle. And so I worry about that stuff too. But the thing that I worry about in politics that you brought up is I think this stuff doesn't end until until a whole bunch of people are just comfortable calling themselves elites. And because they're always going to be elites. I mean, iron law of oligarchy. Uh, and I rant about this all the time on here, but like Ted Cruz, I laugh when Ted Cruz or Elizabeth Warren, they're on the floor of the Senate. First of all, if you're a senator, you are definitionally an elite, right? It is a club of only 100 people. You help write the laws. You're one of the most famous people in the country. You are just simply an elite. There's no getting around it. You cannot be, and as much of an outsider as you possibly could be inside the Senate, you are still an elite. But like Elizabeth Warren was a professor at Harvard Law School. Ted Cruz went to Princeton and then Harvard Law, and his wife is a managing director at Goldman Sachs, and he was the Solicitor General of Texas. How is this guy not an elite? But yeah, they all want to rant about how they're taking it to the elites, and with the exception of like Mitch McConnell and a handful, maybe Nancy Pelosi, there were just very few politicians who are saying, "No, I'm in charge of this institution. I'm actually
I wonder if that's
doing
a
something."
specifically American thing,
Yeah,
because I like the closest I think that has come to this of like, I'm an elite, I know better than you, and you're going to vote for me and you're going to like it. Like you're going to like getting stepped on.
it's very
Is
French.
probably Emmanuel Macron.
Yeah,
Because he had this whole thing when he first got elected where he was like, the French people want a king. You know, the French people want a king, and I have a Jupiterian sense about me, and I am Jupiter. You are going to orbit around me, the God King, and that's how it's going to be. Because France is a republic, but secretly we want a king. And he said this all very openly in interviews, and people elected him twice, three times. I don't keep up with French politics very much, but he's had his successes and his struggles, but he very much gives off that vibe of like, I'm better than you, and that's why you should vote for me. And you know, does that translate into American politics? Is that a uniquely French thing, or I don't know the comparison to make here, but
yeah.
it's possible in some political paradigms.
I mean, I just full disclosure. My wife's from Alaska. My wife came to Washington originally working for Frank Murkowski in the Senate. So there's some conflicts of interest on the periphery here. But I listened to Lisa Murkowski's got a new book out. She was on Morning Joe last week, and I want to stipulate I generally like Lisa Murkowski. I don't love her, but there's a family history there that people can process that any way they want. But like Lisa Murkowski says, she's trying to paint herself as this person, this most unlikely senator. Like there's the fact that she fell into politics is just this amazing story because she is this woman from the frontier state and all this kind of stuff. It's like, no, your dad was a major machine Alaskan politician who who she had to clear the field of opposition when she was in the state legislature to get appointed to fill his own seat when he went to go be governor. And she's like embarrassed to call herself a politician. And it's like, you're nothing but a politician. And and there's no fundamental shame to being a politician, but no one wants to call themselves a politician, even ones who, like, Ron Johnson, who campaigned on term limits. He's still very difficult to get him to admit he's a politician, even though he reneged on his term limit thing, even because he thought that was the term limits were the only way to keep the permanent politicians out. And I don't know that you
We're
can run a
ignoring
political system where people are ashamed to be politicians.
the 800-pound gorilla in the room here, which is Donald Trump, obviously. And
Sure.
Trump has this unique positioning where, again, I believe this, like you're saying, with my whole heart, that the most important thing in politics right now is to position yourself as against, as
Right.
anti-elite, against whatever the system is, whatever people are thinking about, you're against that and you could do it better. And Donald Trump has this really, really interesting method of, he's a billionaire. He's as much an elite as anybody, arguably, but he had very successfully somehow positioned himself as the blue collar billionaire, right?
Right.
And he, talks like, and that, I think a part of it is how genuinely the rest of the elites don't like him, and how he parlays that into "I'm just like you." The rest of the elites think that he dresses poorly, he's tacky, his hair is bad, he's stupid, and he says stupid things, and his verbal tics are that of a dumb idiot. And he basically parlays that into "I'm just like you." And he can do this because, you look at his penthouse in New York, and it's literally gold everywhere. But that's kind of like, Democrats would call that's what a poor person's idea of a billionaire is a guy who
Right.
just has a gold on his toilet, gold
Right.
carpets, gold ceilings, gold furniture. The Democrats mean this as an insult when they say, like, you're a poor guy's idea of a rich guy. But the thing is, that works.
Mm-hmm.
Like, Donald Trump is a poor guy's idea of a rich guy, and therefore he can ally himself with the working class somehow. And it's the one of the strangest but most successful political positionings that I've seen in decades, in terms of Donald Trump somehow managing to be the anti-system guy, the anti-elite guy, as a New York real estate billionaire.
So it's funny you bring it. I mean, you're preaching to the choir on all the Trump stuff, but on the billionaire thing, I've been I've been fascinated by this. We sort of started out talking about the performative nature of Zohran, and he's not really, he hasn't actually done the homework on whether or not his policies could work. They just sound like what his constituents would want. Um, this idea that there should be no billionaires,
Mhm.
um, I find to be like, there's certain ideas, like defund the police is a great one, but like defund the police is also kind of obvious to people who disagree with it, the problems with it. There's this paraphrasing de Tocqueville. There's this idea. De Tocqueville would talk about something, a clear but false idea. This idea that we'd be better off with no billionaires is one of these things that is very seductive to people, but incredibly perniciously stupid if you actually start thinking it through. Particularly for a New York City mayor, given that a big chunk of the budget is predicated on a big chunk of the budget for social services is predicated on the fact that billionaires live there. And if they didn't live there, New York City, the poor would be much worse off in New York. Where do you think this comes from? Like, what is the underlying cause that you think on the sort of progressive left for that kind of thinking, like a maximum wage
Yeah.
kind of stuff?
I mean, so first of all, I should say that I'm 100% in agreement with you that this is kind of a ridiculous thing. Billionaires are value neutral to me, in the sense that some of them got rich doing very good pro social things. There are some of them that got rich doing anti-social things. But it's billionaires are in and of themselves not morally one way or the other. And I think that, even for my more progressive friends, all I have to do is point at, like, Sweden or Norway. Sweden has more billionaires per capita than
Right.
America does. And I think it shows, like, you don't have to have, if you want your nice progressive Nordic social safety net model kind of thing, that can be fully implemented while still having capitalism, while still having
Right.
billionaires. If you're a progressive, the the abolish billionaire thing does not have to be part of your thing. You can get everything you want without that. So the fact that you add that on there does say something. And I think this is one of kind of the original sins of like capital L left politics, is that for leftists who are kind of in that world, every problem in society must come down to billionaires or the rich, the 1%, or like giant corporations. And they are unable to conceive of problems in society that are not caused by those things. And like to give one example, because I'm involved in housing politics a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I talk all the time about the need to build more housing, how we have a housing crisis in our biggest, bluest cities because Democrats don't let people build housing, through thickets of regulation and environmental reviews and zonings and community board hearings and just this giant pile of procedural nonsense that we go through. And when you point this out to my fellow Democrats on the left, many of them will say, well, no, it's not about that. It's not about zoning. It's not about the community board that has too much power. It's about and they'll kind of, you can see the gears turning.
Mm-hmm.
It's billionaire oligarchs who are controlling. It's there's conspiracy theories about how like BlackRock is buying up all the housing in America, or that there's an oligarchy with the real page, the people colluding on prices, and it's just none of that is none of that explains why like Austin is cheaper than New York.
Right.
Are there fewer billionaires in Texas? Does Texas have less capitalism than San Francisco? No, it's just because it's expensive in San Francisco because they don't build, but it's very difficult for them to kind of conceive of a problem where the problem is like middle class NIMBY homeowners, or the problem is the procedural fetish that Democrats
Right.
have. Every problem must be conceived that it's a giant corporation or a billionaire or the rich moneyed elite, and there's like this form of blindness where if a problem is caused by something other than that, they just can't see it. And I think that's the root of a lot of like, just we have to get rid of billionaires because that's the original sin in their worldview.
Yeah. I mean, the idea that billionaires, there's somewhere lurking in the manure pile is this idea that billionaires make people poor. And there's just not a lot of evidence for that.
It's zero sum politics. It's I
Yeah.
can only gain at the expense of someone else.
Right. So like it's like it's not to get all Thomas Sowell, but it's a very unconstrained vision kind of thing where it says, like, for me the tell is always when someone talks about wealth distribution, because inherent in the term wealth distribution is the word distribution, which is assumes a static pie kind of thing, right? It says, we only have so many Twix bars, and these guys are getting too many of them, and these people are getting too few of them, and that's not actually how wealth works. And wealth creation, progressives would do themselves a lot of favors if they started talking about wealth creation rather than wealth distribution. But
And that's why I'm so encouraged by the Ezra Klein, Derek Thompson abundance movement, which is not a perfect movement, but I think really is trying to focus Democrats on the idea that like if you want if you're a Democrat and you want government to do big things, number one, you should care about how efficient that is. And number two, you should care about the total volume of stuff that we're able to build. Building more rail is better than building less rail. Building more clean energy is better than building less clean energy. Like the size of the pie matters.
yeah,
Having more stuff, more housing, more infrastructure, all of that is real and contributes to human flourishing in a real way. And it's not, I think that they're actually doing a very good job of reorienting a large chunk of democratic politics around that.
so I want to ask you about that in a second, but it just one point that I forgot in my sleep deprived haze, when you're talking about BlackRock buying up housing, to some, I mean, BlackRock is, I mean, there are a bunch of private equity kind of firms that are buying up housing, but the reason why they're buying up housing is because housing is scarce, and so it's a increasingly valuable asset. The single item, commodity, whatever I'm supposed to call it, um, best performing asset of the 20th century, beating platinum, diamonds, gold, rare earth minerals, was the New York City taxicab medallion. It went up like 850,000% from 1930. Why? Because the city capped the total number of medallions at whatever the number was in the 1930s and held it there. And so therefore it became increasingly scarce in economic terms to the point where millionaire groups would get together and buy them because so they were so valuable. The best way to make them less valuable is to make more taxi cab medallions, and the TLC refused to do it, and so Uber came in. And I feel bad for some of these immigrant families whose their entire dynasty was built around owning a taxi cab medallion, but that was just terrible economics. But I still want to ask you about the abundance Democrats thing. I've written about this a bit. Um, I like Mark Dunkelman's book, Why Nothing Works. I really like Yoni Applebaum's book, Stuck. I have not made my way all the way through Abundance yet. I have it. I pick it up and put it down. Some of that is personal issues, but I've been a sort of two cheers for abundance Democrats person because first of all, I think it's good for the Democratic Party and therefore it's good for the country if you guys pursue that stuff. And I also think it's good it will lead to improvements in the things that you care about, housing and all the rest. The reason I'm not a three cheers guy, and I'm just curious what your response is to this. I'm a Hayek guy, right? And Hayek has this one of his most powerful ideas is about the knowledge problem, about how experts can't know everything, they can't outthink the market. Economic planners, price fixers, all these kinds of things. They'll just never have enough data. They'll never have enough knowledge about how things work at the ground level in real time. It's the whole nobody knows how to build a pencil kind of thing, right? And I am reluctant to say, well, all of the sort of Ezra Klein manqués in public policy, all they need to do is get rid of the red tape that stymies their economic planning, and they'll then get everything right. Economic planning still goes wrong in totalitarian, authoritarian countries where red tape is not an issue. There are whole cities that are white elephants in China, and red tape was not the issue. And so I agree with the red tape problem, but like it's still like there's the as Virginia Pastrell put it, like their problem, their argument is about liberating bureaucrats to do what they want rather than liberating the economy to do what's best. And I'm sympathetic to that. I don't want to rule out the abundance stuff because I think there's a lot of merit to it. I just don't think it's the panacea that Ezra makes it sound like in his book.
Yeah. Coming from where I am, it's very funny to hear you say that. Like I get a chuckle out of this because what you're saying is, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson mostly want to set the bureaucrats free to do a lot of government funded stuff, and to do it faster and more efficiently. Where I am, I have to fight off about a bunch of leftists who say abundance is all just free market nonsense and they
Mm-hmm.
want to destroy the state and they want to tear down the state and they just want unregulated, unmoderated capitalism to do everything. And so I'm used to telling people on the left, well, like, yes, they want to make it easier for private developers to build housing, but they
Right.
also want for the state to be unshackled. And you, as a progressive, you should want the state to be unshackled as well. And so now I'm going to tell you, like, yes, they want the state to be unshackled, but they also do want private developers and things like the free market to be significantly more unshackled as well. And look, like I'm a Hayekian to some extent as well, in the sense that not a pure Hayekian, but there's a lot of valuable nuggets of truth that you can get from reading Hayek. Absolutely. And you can't central plan everything. You can plan a few things. Like there's a
Mm-hmm.
few you can't know everything, but like the idea that there should be subways in New York, for instance, seems
Sure.
pretty obvious to me. And so we should build subways. Like the idea that we should have high speed rail between in the Boston to DC corridor. I think we're pretty safe on that one. That's probably a good bet. And beyond that, even if you're very, very skeptical of that kind of stuff, I think we have to live in a second best world. I would approach someone who's skeptical of government intervention by telling them, look, this if California is going to build high speed rail, would you prefer it to cost $10 billion or $500 billion?
Right.
I would prefer it to cost $10 billion and to get done quickly so that we can see how successful it is and move on to the next thing. Right now, California, I believe it was that they passed the high speed rail initiative in something like 2007 or something like
I
that,
was going
and
to
it's
say
going to be
eight,
like
something like that. Yeah.
and their current timeline is like 2046
Yeah.
to get it finished, and not even between LA and San Francisco. Like, it won't even be the full route. And like, that's nobody wants that. The government is gonna be doing things for the foreseeable future. We could live in some first best world where we have this minimalized state or whatever, but even if that's your point of view, you want the government to be able to do the things it's going to do efficiently. So we need to get, whether it's green energy, because solar is, even if you don't care about, even if you're like, think hippies are stupid and you just want to punch left on that, like, solar is the future. Just straight economics, the cost economics of solar are going to beat everything else in the long run. And we want it to be easy to build that rather than difficult, because cheap energy is good for the economy. Even if you're purely on a conservative economic bent here, the cost economics of solar are so good that we should be getting out of the way and letting solar build. And like, this is why one of the things I tell my friends on the left is that Texas builds more wind energy and solar energy by a lot compared to any other blue state, compared to California,
Sure.
compared to anywhere else. And it's not because Texas is a bunch of, Greenpeace hippies. It's because Texas lets them do it.
Right.
So
Right.
so what argument is there against that?
Yeah. No. Look, I'm less sold on solar than you are. I mean, I've read about, just because it's so easy to make solar panels now and all that. I get that the scale of it. I'm still I still got my big foam finger for cold fusion, but we'll see. That may be a while.
I
Um,
think we should chase nuclear, especially like small modular
yeah.
nuclear stuff. I think we should absolutely also be investing in that.
Um, but I'm with you on the point. Like, some things are just prudential questions, right? And so I think the the decision to do high speed rail in California was made worse by all the things that you're talking about, the zoning and the permitting and the environmental impact statements and all that kind of stuff. But if I were doing national economic planning, I wouldn't have done. I certainly wouldn't have started in California, and I wouldn't have started in New York to DC. I would have, weirdly enough, and the only person I've ever talked to who made a really compelling free market case for high speed rail without much government subsidy, except for like giving the permits, um, is Houston to Dallas, because high speed rail, for every like degree of elevation, it gets really crazy expensive, and which would suggest it'd be good for Florida. But the other thing that makes it really expensive is lots of municipalities where you have to do eminent domain through densely populated places. And so Florida becomes a problem. Also, it's just a swamp. But like, it's fairly underpopulated area between Houston and Dallas, and it's very flat. And I think there's a really compelling case there. But Texans are just less hungry politically for high speed rail than Californians are. So that's a place where the political process responded to political desire without necessarily the best economic calculation, I would argue.
There's a great high speed rail map. And it's not the one you usually see. Usually people put out this map of like, what if we had this high speed rail and it's crisscrossing the whole country, and it's like completely unrealistic lines from like Salt Lake to, crossing the Rocky Mountains into San Francisco, a line that nobody would ride.
Yeah.
But there's a better one put out by a person named Alon Levy, and Alon has this map of like, Alon is probably the world's number one like cost guru in terms of why do transportation systems cost so much, and what do they do in Istanbul and Singapore
Mm-hmm.
and Rome that we do differently here, so that their subway costs literally 10% to build of what New York City spends or whatever. I would say probably the number one expert in the world. Um, and Alon has a map of like where it actually makes sense. And the Northeast corridor, it makes sense. There's like Chicago, maybe up into Wisconsin a little bit. The Texas Triangle makes sense. California makes sense. All of this is kind of assuming that you can build somewhat efficiently. It's assuming that you're not
Right.
going to get stuck with eminent domain for 20 years. It's assuming that you can get your permits and that you can actually build judiciously. But in the sense of like, in what areas of the country would ridership actually justify the cost of running a high-speed rail system? There are some areas of America. The problem is that eminent domain is such a problem, and environmental permitting is such a problem, and all of these giant thicket of regulatory stuff that you
Right.
have to go through makes it, so long and so costly. Then it doesn't necessarily pencil out. But if we could actually solve those problems, I think we would be able to enjoy nice things.
Yeah, I'm open to all that. Like those are all prudential questions as far as I'm concerned. Um, but we're running out of time, and I did want to go back to Zoran just for a second because you're in New York. Um, I think that a lot of our political problems, this whole elites, no one wants to be an elite, no one wants to be responsible, no one wants to be an insider, all that kind of stuff. A lot of that is a downstream function of our primary system. And I personally I would absolutely just get rid of, if I could, small d Democratic primaries. I would have them done by conventions. I would come up, we are the only advanced industrialized democracy in the world whose parties have voluntarily given up the ability to pick their own candidates.
Bring back smoke-filled rooms is what I say.
I'm a smoke-filled room guy, so I have
Yes,
no problem with that
absolutely.
whatsoever. Not going to happen. And so I've been perfectly willing, as sort of, what would you call it, second best choices, to kick the tires on ranked choice voting. I don't love it. What is Arrow's paradox that says any system of election is going to have problems, right? So, uh, how is it working in New York? Not just in light of the Mamdani thing, but in general. Um, to Going in, it felt like the progressive left didn't like it because Cuomo was going to win. Now that he didn't, they seem to like it, and the sort of centrist normies are a little more troubled by it. How do you think about it?
I think that it's unclear what the long run is going to be because uh, we've had a sample size of two, right? We'd had this with the Eric Adams election, and we had this year. In the Adams election, I think from a moderates perspective, it did well in that the top two ended up being two moderates. It was Eric Adams and Catherine Garcia. And Catherine Garcia really came very close to winning. I'm still upset that Catherine Garcia did not win. I think she was like 0.5% away from winning, just a couple thousand votes. And she was basically a somewhat boring, technocratic, middle of the road Democrat who had been in charge of like the sanitation department and was
Mm-hmm.
basically just a good government kind of, I'm going to be competent and do, I'm generically Democratic in the ways that matter for like a New York City primary. But so for that one, I thought that ranked choice had a good result there in that it elevated Garcia further than she would have normally gotten. I don't think she could have won like just a necessarily a regular primary, but she very nearly through ranked choice voting very nearly beat Eric Adams. So I was happy then. With this round, I'm less happy because I think we had kind of there's something like election nerds call this something like the middle squeeze or something like that, where the
Mm-hmm.
two extremes in ranked choice end up squeezing out the middle. I think somebody like Brad Lander, who's fairly progressive, but like let's call
Most
him
listeners
in
don't know who any
between.
of these people are, so like this, we're not,
Yeah,
we,
let's call
who,
Brad Lander somewhere in between Zohran. Like he's not a socialist. He proud progressive is probably how he would describe himself, but he's not as far left as Zohran. He's not a socialist, and he's certainly more to the left of Cuomo. I think Lander could have beaten either Cuomo or Zohran in a one-on-one battle. If it was
mm-hmm.
Lander versus Zohran, everybody who's uneasy about how far left Zohran would have just, would have gone to Lander. If it was Cuomo against Lander, again, nobody really likes Cuomo that much, so all the progressives would have grumbled a little bit and gotten on board. But you end up with what's called this middle squeeze where Lander, because there's two people, both of whom he could have beaten individually,
Mm-hmm.
but people group into camps basically, and he gets squeezed and he ends up coming third. And that's a problem with ranked choice voting systems. And you mentioned like Arrow's impossibility theorem, that it's you can lose an election, you can come in third even though you would have beaten individually both of the first two. Like
Right.
that's a thing that can happen, and I think that's probably did happen in this election. So ranked choice, it seems to me like very slightly better than just first past the post, but like I think the people who are enthusiastic about it can overrate how good it is because it can also have bad outcomes. So,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm
I'm at
neutral.
sort of where I am. I liked. I found it appealing because the argument was when the argument was on net. In most cases, it encourages the least objectionable candidate, but it doesn't seem like that's actually the case. And so, last question on this, because this is an obsession of mine, and I've written about it a bunch. I had a bunch of people on here about this, particularly because I truly love New York City. I mean, I haven't lived there in a long time, but I grew up on 84th and Broadway, and I probably, I think
Not
I've
too
lit.
far from Zabar's. Then I go
That's
up there a
exactly
lot.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah. And um, I still call myself a New Yorker, even though lived in DC longer than I lived in New York. Uh, what I find fascinating about urban politics generally in America, Portland, Seattle, cities I know pretty well because of family, or Chicago, right? Which a city I love. The whole premise of democracy in modern sort of basic normie democracy is that people vote their interests, and most normal bourgeois people, and I mean that whether they're poor or they're rich, um, their interests are about safe streets, good schools, good employment. That's why you live in a city in the first place. Cities are the places where you go for jobs, right? And then a rich cultural offering, but that's really not government policy to a certain extent. I mean, like keeping the museums open, fine, whatever. Nice parks, all that kind of stuff. And yet, it feels like in most major cities, those voters either aren't voting or aren't voting on those issues, aren't voting. I don't want to sound like Thomas Frank because I cannot stand Thomas Frank, but it feels like they are not voting on their interests. They are voting on these performative things. And when you look at what like homelessness and drug problems and crime problems have done to just more cities than you can count, it feels like they get these policies because people are voting aspirationally based upon some vision rather than on their own interests. Why? Just like, I mean, I have my own theories, but like, why? Why? I mean, like Rudy Giuliani. I mean, he's a crazy freakazoid now, but he was really successful, and Bloomberg picked up on his success and built on it. And I don't like
yeah.
Bloomberg that much, but like every time New York City has this period of normalcy and prosperity and growth, it's like there's this antibody response that says, no, 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 we have to live in dramatic times and have crazy policies that are going to that are going to derail the gravy train. And why?
Can I give a little bit of a meandering answer here?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was a meandering question, so you have every
So
right.
the first thing I want to say is that I think that this is coming loose. This kind of vote your interest idea is coming loose in ways that go beyond localized politics. If you look at, how do people vote in nationalized politics? There's a lot of unions that are voting for Donald Trump, and whose jobs are going to be destroyed by his trade policies. There's a lot of people who Latinos are voting for Trump, and now you see these very ironic stories in the media about how their family members are getting deported because they don't have
Mm-hmm.
paperwork, and they like I didn't think it was going to come from me. It's a very like
Right.
the leopards eating faces party. I never
Yeah.
thought they were going to eat my face,
Right.
but this is coming loose in a lot of ways, and you saw this in New York. You see this nationally, where like Zohran won people voting over who make over 100,000 a year in New York, and Cuomo won people who make less than $50,000 a year. It's very much like, Millionaires for Socialism is a new
Mm-hmm.
thing that actually exists. And I think a lot of this is downstream of education polarization, which is
Mm-hmm.
one of the strongest forces in American politics today. That everything is polarized now around, do you have a college degree or not? That's part of the racial depolarization that we see, where you know uh, blacks and Latinos are voting for Republicans more in the most recent federal election. I think a lot of that is downstream of just education.
Mm-hmm.
Blacks and Latinos with college degrees are not seeing that, but everything is now college degree, which means it's cultural. And you know, I, this does have a logical endpoint. Like, you can't do it forever. There is a backlash. You see this in San Francisco, where they elected a very moderate mayor recently, Daniel Lurie, who's actually making incredible strides in San Francisco, who's cleaned up the streets there, who's got a great relationship with the police department, and God forbid they might actually build some housing this year. You saw this in New York in 2021, where Eric Adams, at the time, the public disorder was a huge issue, and
Right.
that's why you saw two moderate candidates, Eric Adams and Catherine Garcia, be the top two vote getters in the Democratic primary, and we ultimately ended up electing a cop. We
Right.
elected a guy who was a cop because public disorder was such a big concern. Both, homeless people wandering the streets and crimes happening and loot, and whether it's looting or whether it's just the perception of looting. But I think what Zohran is benefiting from right now is kind of the peace dividend, so to speak, that Eric Adams, for all his weird personal faults and his mundane little corruptions, has done a good job of cleaning up the city. He's done a good job of getting homeless people off the streets and into shelters. The subways are safer now. The murder rate in New York this year is on track to be the lowest in New York's history,
Hmm.
going back as long as they've kept official statistics, basically. So now it's just not something people think about. We're kind of living in the dividend of peace. And so now that people aren't thinking about that, now they're freer to kind of express things culturally and with their identities and with this kind of, softer side of politics that is not just vote your interests. I think that's kind of I don't know, maybe this is the whole meme of like, weak men create hard times strong men, blah, that whole cycle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Might be what we're seeing here.
All right. 30 seconds or less. Who's going to win?
In the New York mayor's race,
Mm-hmm.
Mamdani.
Okay. So sell your bonds, New Yorkers. All right. Jeremiah Johnson, thank you so much for doing this. I hope you'll come back.
Absolutely, anytime.
All right. And so Jeremiah Johnson, Dispatch contributor, but the real day job is his Substack, his excellent Substack, Infinite Scroll. And he's also part of the Center for New Liberalism. And thank you again. Do not sign off. Two things. One, we have an incredibly stupid dad joke on here. It will not embarrass you. Some of America's foremost public intellectuals have done this. Francis Fukuyama, on down. But I do a close after you leave, and then I say, I'll see you next time. And then the guest voice comes back on and says, no, you won't. This is a podcast. So I just need you to say the words, no, you won't. This is a podcast. You can do it right now if it's okay. Okay, so Jeremiah Liver Eating Johnson has left the studio. After we stopped recording, Adam, our producer, jumped in to ask Jeremiah why he was so confident Mamdani was going to win. And I can't give the full flavor and justice to it, but I thought if listeners might have the same reaction. So part of it is just sort of gut. Part of it is prediction markets are very solid. Part of it is in favor of Mamdani, and it's not like prediction markets are always right, but like you need a good argument for why they're not. And Curtis Sliwa, who's the longtime head and founder of the Guardian Angels in New York, is just not a serious candidate. I agree with that entirely. And Eric Adams, the current mayor, is corrupt and unpopular. And so, you know, he wasn't. He was just saying he's if you had to bet, that's the way you go. Thank you all for listening today. I have one of the craziest days ahead of me that I've had in a long time, so I will spare you my notes and impressions of the Aspen Ideas Festival, and we'll hopefully figure out how to do the solo before the 4th of July. My apologies if we don't get that figured out. And other than that, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.
No, you won't, Jonah. This is a podcast.